Hi again, A-Pushers. Welcome back for the second part of our discussion about the origins of the Cold War. Today we're going to talk about the Asian aspect of it. And for the most part, the United States kind of ignored Asia during the beginning of the Cold War. But let's go back to the end of World War II. As it was winding up, as I said before, we were trying to get the Soviets to be involved in the war in Asia. It turns out that probably wasn't a good idea on our part, but we didn't know how it was going to end, so we did it anyway. Um, when the war did end, we had a different kind of platform for dealing with Asia. We had Japan. We occupied it ourselves. Nobody else helped. We didn't have to divide it up like we did with Germany. It was just the United States. And as you see here, it was just pretty much General MacArthur, who had been the governor of the Philippines before the Japanese kicked him out, and he returned. And then after the war, we made him um, the commander, basically, or governor of Japan when we occupied Japan. So he did kind of the same thing we did in Germany. We rounded up all the war criminals and executed a bunch of them. Uh, Side fact, we executed Japanese generals for doing the same thing that George Bush authorized us to do to terrorists in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Iraq, called waterboarding. But so we hanged seven of them. Um, uh, Actually, the way we handled Japan, though, worked out well. The Japanese, as it says, cooperated with us. We developed a new constitution modeled on the United States Constitution. Their economy began to quickly rebound and grow, much like West Germany did. So when you look at the American response to World War II, we kind of did the opposite of what we did in World War One. After World War One, you might remember we punished the enemy with the Treaty of Versailles. After World War II, we rebuilt our enemies and turned them into two of our greatest trading partners in the post-war era. As I said in the last discussion, part of it was basically to build um, capitalism around the world to make sure that trade and capitalism would secure peace, which it did for the Cold War, kind of. Um, all right, so that's kind of how Japan went. Um, China didn't go so well. China during the war had been an American ally. We were helping them fight the Japanese and kick the Japanese out of China. In fact, you might know, have you ever heard of the Flying Tigers? It's the airplanes with the mouth on the front of it. Those were American Marines that were fighting in the Chinese army against the Japanese before the United States got involved in World War II. So we'd been helping China for a long time. And when the war was over, we kind of just walked away and said, good luck, China. Uh, See you later. And when we did that, the Chinese that were in China, uh, Chinese, the communists that were in China, were fighting the government that we had supported during the war, the nationalists. The nationalists were headed by a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. The communists were headed by a guy named Mao Zedong. And the two of them obviously didn't get along, and they fought a civil war. The United States did not help the nationalists after World War II, and eventually the communists won. Mao Zedong took over the government, and China, as it says here, a quarter of the world's population at the time, became communist overnight, which was a huge embarrassment for the United States and Truman's containment policy. Obviously, he didn't contain them too well when China becomes communist. Um, so that was a huge embarrassment for us. And again, it happened because we were focused on Europe. We didn't really care about Asia, uh, ethnocentric United States. We just cared about what was going on in Europe, and that didn't work out too well. Also, as you see here, the Russians ended up exploding their own atomic bomb in 1949 much faster than we thought they would. As it turns out, they were able to do it so much faster because they spied on us. um, all right. So we end up getting in this race with the Soviets over building weapons. They build the atomic bomb. We then build a hydrogen bomb. Then they build the hydrogen bomb, and we just keep going back and forth. And it's a matter of how many bombs can we build, and it gets kind of ugly. It leads to the arms race. Lots of money being spent on weapons. So I've got this really cool website you need to look at. Check this one out. It's about um, the explosion of atomic bombs around the world for testing or for war. We're the only ones that ever used it in war, but it's got all that stuff on there, and it's really, really good. It takes about 15 minutes, but it is well worth the effort to watch. So check that out. All right, then the Korean War happens, and In 1950, the way this worked out was we had invited again the Russians to get involved, the Soviets to get involved in the war in Asia, and so they did. 3 days before the Japanese surrendered, they invade Korea, where the Japanese were, and when the war actually ends, they had gotten down to the 38th parallel, about halfway down the peninsula. So that's where the war ends, and that's where they stopped. So, with them occupying the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, they decided, like they did in Eastern Europe, to set up a friendly government there. The United States and the Soviets had agreed, though, when the war was over, that we would allow, just like in Europe, elections to take place, and that, just like in Eastern Europe, never happened. So, what you ended up having was two rival governments on the Korean Peninsula that didn't like each other, and that's the way it sat until 1950 when the North invaded the South, catching the South completely off guard. So this becomes the first test of um, the United Nations, and Truman uses his containment policy again. The idea is to not allow the Soviets and the communists to spread their influence around the world. So he calls on the United Nations to act. And so the Security Council in the United Nations got together to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about the National Security Memorandum, NSC 68, which is actually, I put the document in the first half of this slideshow. So when you get a chance, I just gave you the summary. Take a look at the summary. It's well worth your time and effort to check it out. Because again, what it does is it sets America on a permanent war footing from then on. And we've been that way ever since. As you see, it recommends a quadrupling of defense spending. At that time, our defense spending was 50 billion a year. That's incredibly cheap. Today, it's approaching 800 billion a year, more than the next 12 countries combined. All right, we are, as I said, the world's number one arms dealer, and we spend a lot of money on our weapons. So again, this document puts us on a war footing, makes us a military country. Um, I like the quote here at the bottom. It says, one of the planners of NSC 68 says, there is practically nothing the country could not do if it wanted to do it. And that's a mentality that gets us into trouble because we did believe that in the 1950s. We had won World War II. We had the best economy in the world. We were the world's number one power. And just like Britain after the French Indian War, it kind of went to our heads. And as you'll see, in Vietnam, when we thought we could just throw our weight around and get what we wanted, it turns out that's not really the way the world works, and we paid the price for that. So again, so back to the UN. The UN is thrown. The issue of Korea is thrown into the UN's hands, and they have to deal with it. So the Security Council gets together and they decide that they're going to authorize military force to push North Korea out of South Korea. Um, Ironically, if you remember, the Security Council is made up of 5 countries, one of which is the Soviet Union, and they have veto power. The Soviet Union pulls a no-brainer here, though. They say, we're going to boycott this session because we don't agree with what's going on. And they allowed the Security Council to authorize force against North Korea. Turns out that was a bad idea. What the Russians should have done is simply vetoed the whole proposal, and that would have prevented the Korean War in the first place, although America still might have invaded anyway. But in this case, we're using the United Nations as our proxy or backup for us to fight the war ourselves. So even though it's a United Nations war, we end up supplying 88% of the forces, the men and the equipment to fight the war. MacArthur, the guy who had run Japan, is put in charge of it. He seems to be our Asian expert, and so he takes control. And I'm gonna show you a map here in a second. So the North invades over the 38th parallel and pushes the South Korean army all the way down to the very bottom of Korea to a place called Pusan. Now, that is, I'm sure, not the way it's pronounced. I've been told by my Korean students before, but that's the way Americans pronounce it. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it any other way. So this kind of shows you a map of the invasion. So the North invades the South, pushes them all the way down to what's called the Pusan perimeter. Then our boy Douglas MacArthur invades with the United Nations authorization, and he does it 2 places. He invades in Busan, but he also invades up here in a place called Incheon, which is right below the 30th parallel, and catches the North Korean army off guard gets in behind them and just decimates their military. He promised the forces that are America that we would be home by Christmas 1950. So as you see from the map, MacArthur ends up pushing the North Korean army all the way up to the Chinese border, even though the authorization originally from the United Nations said that we had to push the North Koreans out of South Korea. They agree and allow MacArthur to keep pushing them north. Probably not a good idea in hindsight that that happened, but the hope was we could push communism all the way out of North Korea and reunite North Korea. So as we're pushing to the north, the Chinese are up here saying, "Hey, we don't like you getting close to our border. Stop!" And we didn't. So one night in the winter of 1950-51, the Chinese invaded North Korea, catching the American army off guard and basically handing us the worst defeat America has ever suffered in a war against anybody. They literally caught us off guard, and American soldiers woke up in the middle of the night to the sounds of people yelling, "Death to America, die Yankee!" And they bayoneted and shot and just caught American troops. It's almost like the Paoli massacre during the Revolution, where the British bayoneted sleeping American soldiers. They kicked our butts. What this map doesn't show is they ended up pushing our army all the way back down to the Pusan perimeter until we regrouped, got our act together, and then pushed the Chinese and the North Korean army back to the 30th parallel where it stalemated. All right, and that was the way it was for the rest of the war. So after the Chinese had gotten involved in the war, MacArthur said, "Hey, we've got to fight the Chinese also, so give me the authorization to invade China." Truman was like, "That's crazy. We're not doing that." McCarthy said, "All right, well then give me nuclear weapons that I can bomb China and punish them for helping North Korea." Truman again said, "Are you out of your mind? The whole idea of the Cold War is to avoid a hot war, and if we start nuking China, that's going to get a whole lot of attention from the Soviet Union and other countries around the world. It wouldn't look good." So Truman rejected MacArthur's plan. MacArthur continued to talk in the press and criticize Truman. Again, Truman didn't have a lot of respect at this point, and so MacArthur, being the war hero from the Pacific, had a lot more clout, and Truman had had enough of that, and eventually Truman fired MacArthur, which was a shocking development because MacArthur's very popular and Truman wasn't. So firing our number one general in the war was kind of a setback. MacArthur actually does something kind of interesting. He comes back to the United States. He gives a speech in front of Congress in which he says, "Old soldiers never die; they just fade away." And he did. He faded away after that, and we never heard from him again, even though people wanted him to run for president. So that kind of sets us off to understand the beginnings of the Cold War. You've got basically the Soviets in Europe creating their buffer zone. Um, there's little minor communist revolutions in other countries like Greece and Turkey. In Asia, you've got a huge communist takeover of China. You've got expansion of communism into Korea. So the containment policies working fairly well in Europe, not so well in Asia. And but that sets us down the road. That's more to come, and you're going to see that in future episodes. So thank you very much. At the end of this, there is a question for you folks to answer regarding, was this all necessary? Did this have to happen, or was this all a big mistake? So take a look at that, and I wish you well, and see you later, folks.